The studio lights shone brightly as Joe Rogan adjusted his microphone. Across from him sat Daniel Carter, a well-known liberal journalist with a sharp mind and a reputation for challenging conservative views. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the recording equipment. The show had just begun, and millions of people were watching live. Joe leaned back in his chair, a slight smile on his face. "All right, Daniel," he said. "Let's get into it." Daniel sat forward, his eyes full of confidence. He had been preparing for this moment for weeks. He knew Joe Rogan was a tough opponent, someone who could think fast and challenge any argument. But Daniel was ready. He had studied Joe's past interviews, his views, and even his weaknesses. Today, he was determined to prove a point, to outsmart Joe Rogan on his own podcast. The first question. Joe started with a simple question. "So, Daniel, you've been vocal about free speech and misinformation. What's your take on censorship?" Daniel smirked. "Well, Joe, free speech is important, but we also have to be responsible. There are things that shouldn't be allowed to spread, like harmful conspiracy theories." Joe nodded, listening carefully. "But who decides what's harmful?" he asked. Daniel leaned forward. "That's the role of experts and fact-checkers. We can't just let people spread lies without consequences." Joe rubbed his chin. "But don't you think that can be dangerous? What if the so-called experts get it wrong? We've seen it happen before." Daniel chuckled. "Joe, that's exactly the problem. People don't trust experts anymore because of misinformation. If we let just anyone speak, the truth gets lost." Joe raised an eyebrow. "But who controls the truth?" The room went silent for a moment. Daniel hadn't expected Joe to push back so quickly. He took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. The debate gets intense. As the conversation continued, the energy in the room started to shift. Joe wasn't just asking questions. He was challenging every point, making Daniel defend his views. The audience could feel the tension rising. Daniel tried a new approach. "Joe, let's be honest. Your podcast gives a platform to people who spread dangerous ideas. Don't you think that's a problem?" Joe didn't flinch. "I talk to people from all sides. My job is to have conversations, not to decide who's right or wrong. Shouldn't people be able to think for themselves?" Daniel shook his head. "Not when it leads to harm. Words have power, Joe. Some of your guests have said things that influence millions of people. That's a big responsibility." Joe leaned forward, his eyes locked on Daniel. "So, should I only invite people who agree with you?" Daniel hesitated. "No, but—" Joe interrupted. "Because that sounds like censorship." The audience was glued to their screens. The debate was no longer just a discussion. It was a battle of ideas. Daniel had started strong, but now he was on the defensive. The turning point. Sensing the shift, Daniel decided to take a risk. He smirked and said, "Joe, let's be real. You're not an expert. You're a podcast host. Why should people trust your opinions over scientists and journalists?" For a brief second, Joe didn't say anything. He just stared at Daniel, a small smile playing at the corners of his lips. Then he leaned back in his chair and spoke slowly. "I don't tell people what to think," he said. "I ask questions. I let them hear different perspectives. And guess what? People are smart enough to decide for themselves." Daniel opened his mouth to respond, but Joe wasn't finished. "The real problem isn't misinformation. The real problem is that some people think they have the right to control what others hear, what they believe. That's not protecting truth, that's controlling it." The room went silent. Daniel's confidence wavered for the first time. He had come here to outsmart Joe Rogan. But now he found himself on the losing side of the argument. And the debate had only just begun. Daniel Carter shifted in his chair, sensing the weight of Joe Rogan's words. The conversation had taken an unexpected turn, and for the first time, he felt the pressure of defending his stance. But he wasn't ready to back down. He had come here to prove a point, and he was determined to regain control of the debate. He leaned forward, his voice firm. Joe, you say you're just asking questions, but let's be honest. Your podcast has influence. When you invite controversial guests, their words don't just stay in the studio. They spread. And sometimes, those words cause real harm. Joe remained calm, nodding slightly. All right, Daniel. Give me an example. Daniel smirked. He had prepared for this. Sure. Remember that guest who claimed that certain medical treatments weren't necessary? Millions of people listened. Some of them believed it. And guess what? That kind of misinformation can cost lives. The audience watching from home could feel the tension. This was the moment Daniel had been waiting for. He had Joe cornered. If Joe admitted responsibility, it would mean he accepted that his platform could be dangerous. If he denied it, he would look careless, as if he didn't care about the impact of his words. For a moment, Joe was silent, his expression unreadable. Then he leaned back in his chair and let out a small chuckle. You know, Daniel, he said, his voice steady, that's an interesting argument, but there's a problem with it. Daniel raised an eyebrow. Oh, and what's that? Joe's eyes locked onto his guest. Who decides what's dangerous? You? The government? Big tech companies? Because history has shown us that when people in power control what others can say, it never ends well. The room was dead silent. Daniel opened his mouth to respond, but Joe wasn't finished. Think about it. If we banned every opinion that might be wrong, where do we stop? What if the so-called experts make mistakes? Because they do. History is full of examples. Daniel shook his head. But Joe, this isn't about banning opinions. It's about protecting people from harm. Joe leaned forward, his voice quieter but sharper. Daniel, do you really think people are that weak? That they can't listen to different ideas and think for themselves? The question hung in the air. The live chat exploded with reactions. Some viewers sided with Daniel, saying misinformation was dangerous. Others cheered for Joe, arguing that freedom of speech mattered more than censorship. Daniel hesitated. He had come in confident, sure that he could control the conversation. But now he wasn't so certain. Joe Rogan wasn't just debating. He was making Daniel question his own stance. And the most shocking part of the conversation was still to come. Daniel Carter's confidence wavered for just a second, but he quickly masked it with a smirk. He wasn't going to let Joe Rogan twist the argument in his favor. He had debated top journalists, political figures, and experts. He wasn't about to lose to a podcast host. Taking a deep breath, Daniel leaned forward. Joe, let's be real. You have a responsibility. Millions of people watch your show. When you invite controversial guests and let them spread their views without challenging them, you're not just asking questions, you're amplifying misinformation. Joe tilted his head slightly, his expression calm. You think I don't challenge them? He asked. Daniel nodded. Sometimes, sure. But other times, you just let them talk. And people trust you. They believe what they hear on your podcast. Joe let out a short laugh and shook his head. Daniel, do you really think my audience is that gullible? You don't give people enough credit. They don't just listen and accept everything at face value. They think. They question. That's the whole point of this podcast. Daniel crossed his arms. But not everyone questions Joe. Some people take what they hear and run with it. And when that information is dangerous. Joe cut him off. Then let's talk about the real danger. The danger of silencing people. The danger of saying, this opinion is allowed, and this one isn't. Who decides what's acceptable? You? The media? The government? The studio fell silent. Daniel opened his mouth, but Joe kept going. I've had doctors, scientists, and experts on this show. Some have been praised, some have been criticized. But guess what? A few years ago, some of the same ideas that were labeled misinformation turned out to be true. So tell me, Daniel, should those people have been silenced back then? Or do we admit that sometimes we don't have all the answers? Daniel blinked. He hadn't expected this turn. He had come prepared with facts, studies, and media narratives. But Joe wasn't playing that game. He wasn't defending misinformation. He was attacking the very idea of who gets to control information in the first place. For the first time in the debate, Daniel hesitated, and the audience could see it. The comment section exploded. Some viewers cheered for Joe, while others desperately waited for Daniel's counterargument. But Daniel wasn't ready to back down yet. He straightened in his chair, determination returning to his voice. "So, Joe," he said slowly, "are you saying there should be no limits? That anyone should be able to say anything, no matter the consequences?" Joe's next words would change everything. Joe Rogan let the question hang in the air for a moment. His eyes locked onto Daniel Carter's, and a small smirk played on his lips. He could sense the shift. Daniel was trying to trap him, to push him into a corner where he'd either have to defend absolute free speech or admit that some voices should be silenced. But Joe wasn't falling for it. He leaned forward slightly, his voice calm but firm. "Daniel, let me ask you something. Have you ever been wrong about something before?" Daniel blinked, slightly thrown off. "Of course. Everyone has." Joe nodded. "Exactly. And so have scientists. So have journalists. So have world leaders. In fact, history is full of examples where the so-called truth turned out to be wrong." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "So tell me, if we silence people today because we think they're wrong, what happens when we find out they were actually right all along?" The room was silent. The air felt heavy with tension. Daniel sat back, shaking his head. "Joe, that's not the same thing. We're not talking about simple mistakes. We're talking about dangerous ideas, things that can lead to real harm. Not all speech is harmless." Joe nodded. "I agree. But who decides what's dangerous? Who decides which ideas get banned and which ones are allowed? Because history shows us that when people in power get to decide what's acceptable, they don't always have the public's best interest in mind." Daniel's jaw tightened. He could feel the debate slipping away from him. He had come into this conversation expecting to expose Joe Rogan's recklessness. But instead, Joe had flipped the script. He wasn't just defending his right to free speech. He was questioning the entire system of censorship. The live chat exploded. Comments flooded in. "Joe is making too much sense. Daniel is struggling to keep up. Censorship is never the answer." Daniel clenched his fists under the table. He needed to regain control of the conversation. He had one more argument left, one that he was sure would shake Joe's confidence. He leaned in, lowering his voice slightly. "Joe, let's cut through all the philosophy. Let's talk about responsibility. You say you're just asking questions, but don't you realize that your words have power? That your influence can shape millions of minds?" Joe didn't flinch. He met Daniel's gaze, and in a slow, measured voice, responded, "Yes, I do. And that's exactly why I'll never stop asking questions." The entire room fell silent. Even Daniel didn't have an immediate comeback. Because deep down, he knew Joe Rogan had just won this round. A heavy silence settled over the room. For the first time since their conversation started, Daniel Carter found himself struggling for the right words. He had been so sure he could corner Joe Rogan, that he could expose him as irresponsible, but now he felt something unexpected: doubt. Joe leaned back, letting the silence stretch. He knew that sometimes the best way to win a debate wasn't to argue louder, but to let the weight of truth settle in. Finally, Daniel exhaled, shaking his head. "Joe, free speech is important, but there has to be a line." Joe raised an eyebrow. "And who draws that line, Daniel? You? A fact-checker? Some tech CEO in Silicon Valley? The government?" He paused. "Look, I get it. Nobody wants misinformation to spread. But the moment we start allowing people in power to decide what's true and what isn't, we give up our ability to think for ourselves." Daniel pressed his lips together, as if swallowing an argument he wasn't sure how to make. Joe noticed and pushed further. "Tell me this," he continued. "If we lived 20 years ago, and I had a scientist on here talking about how sugar is more addictive than cocaine, people would have said it was fake news. Turns out that's actually true. But if I hadn't let that guest speak, how many people would still be in the dark?" The air in the studio was charged. The audience was completely silent, all ears on the conversation. Daniel let out a breath. "So you're saying that all opinions should be heard, no matter what?" Joe smirked again. "I'm saying that the world isn't black and white, Daniel. And the second we stop listening to people because they disagree with us, we lose something valuable, the ability to change our minds." Daniel leaned back, pressing his lips together. He had come here with the goal of proving Joe wrong. But now, under the weight of the conversation, he realized Joe wasn't so easy to defeat. And to make things worse, the next thing Joe was about to say would leave the entire room in complete shock. Daniel exhaled sharply, clearly frustrated. He had expected Joe Rogan to stumble, to get flustered, to expose his own recklessness. But instead, Joe remained calm, unwavering. He wasn't playing defense. He was controlling the entire conversation, pushing Daniel into corners he didn't expect to be in. Just when Daniel thought he had regained some ground, Joe leaned forward with a serious expression. "Let me ask you something else," Joe said. "Have you ever changed your mind about a big issue? Something you once believed, but later realized you were wrong about?" Daniel frowned, crossing his arms. "Sure," he admitted cautiously. "People grow. They learn new things." Joe nodded. "Exactly. So imagine if, when you were wrong, people decided that your voice should be silenced, that you shouldn't even be allowed to speak. Would you have had the chance to learn? To change your mind?" Daniel opened his mouth to argue, then closed it. He hesitated. The audience watched, some nodding, some still skeptical, but everyone could feel that something was shifting. Joe continued, "I don't claim to have all the answers, Daniel. I just want people to talk, to ask questions. If we start deciding that some ideas shouldn't even be spoken, we stop progress. We stop discovery. We stop learning." Daniel ran a hand through his hair. He was a debater. He was quick, sharp, used to winning arguments. But this wasn't a normal debate. This was a battle of ideas, and Joe was not losing. Finally, he sighed, his voice lower than before. "I don't know, man," he said. "Maybe you have a point." The audience fell into stunned silence. The critics who had hoped to see Joe get humiliated were now realizing something unexpected. The guest wasn't making Joe look foolish. He was making Joe look brilliant. Then, in a moment that no one could have predicted, Daniel did something shocking. He looked Joe in the eye, let out a small laugh, and said the words that no one expected. "Maybe you're right." The room erupted, but the night wasn't over yet. Joe still had one last bombshell to drop. The atmosphere in the studio was electric. The debate had taken an unexpected turn, and now, all eyes were on Joe Rogan. The audience sat on the edge of their seats, waiting for his next words. Joe leaned in, his expression calm but unwavering. "Daniel," he said, his voice steady, "I get that you care about people. I do too. But let me ask you this. If we silence everyone we don't agree with, what happens when the truth turns out to be something different?" Daniel shifted in his seat, his fingers tightening around the armrests. "It's not about silencing, Joe. It's about preventing harm." Joe nodded, considering. "I get that, but let me ask you something. What if silencing people is the real harm? What if the truth is buried because it's not popular? What if questioning the mainstream is exactly what keeps us from making the same mistakes over and over?" Daniel opened his mouth to respond, but Joe didn't stop. His voice grew more intense. "Look, man, people have been wrong before. About science, about history, about medicine. 100 years ago, doctors were telling people that smoking was healthy. People believed it. And then someone somewhere started asking questions. They were laughed at, shut down, and now we know they were right. Daniel blinked, and for the first time, he looked uncertain. The confidence he had at the beginning of the debate seemed to fade. The audience murmured. They saw it too. This was a battle Daniel might not win. Joe took a sip of water and continued, his words slow and measured. So here's the thing, man. You don't have to agree with me. You don't have to agree with any of my guests. But if your first instinct is to shut someone up instead of challenging their ideas, then maybe you're the one who's afraid of the conversation. Daniel hesitated, his hands fidgeting. He had built his career on arguing, on proving others wrong. But this was different. This wasn't just about winning. This was about something deeper. And for the first time, he had nothing to say. The audience burst into applause, but Joe wasn't gloating. He just leaned back in his chair and let the silence speak for itself. The world had just watched something they would never forget. And in that moment, even Daniel knew he had just been completely outmatched.